Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Emerson from the Treat the Cause podcast and YouTube channel. And if you're interested today in finding out about how melatonin can not only revolutionize your sleep, but also your weight, your blood sugar control, and may actually save you from cancer. And if you're interested in how you can use light as a therapy, keep watching. Let's get started. Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Emerson. I'm here with Todd Lizon from Lifestyle Integration. And we're going to talk today about melatonin. We're going to talk today about light therapy. If you like the video, make sure you share it. That's the way we get to change the world. And press the like button and subscribe button down in the corner during the whole video. So I really want to talk about some recent research on melatonin. Now everybody knows that melatonin is the hormone which is produced by the brain that puts us to sleep. Now what we forget though is that melatonin, the synthesis begins in the morning, the secretion begins in the evening, but we have to initiate the production of melatonin. The initiation of that production of melatonin is caused by watching the sunrise, and which is why a lot of people now are talking about the importance of seeing the sunrise in the morning, because it's that infrared light which stimulates us to start producing the melatonin. Now similarly, it's the infrared light when we see the sunrise which starts the secretion of melatonin, which then gets us ready for sleep. And we're going to be talking to Todd later on about how we want to encourage that process and not discourage it. And that melatonin not only puts us to sleep, and most of that melatonin does its work between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., which is why you want to be getting to sleep about 10 o'clock. But we also know that melatonin also makes our pancreas work much better, which keeps our blood sugar low and our weight low. But the really interesting thing was recent research, and I'll put the link to that study in the show notes below, shows that if you don't honor the circadian rhythm, if you do shift work, if you eat at the wrong time of day, you're not going to get the same benefit. In fact, high levels of melatonin in the evening when we should be fasting, which lower our blood sugar, put us to sleep, help us lose weight. If we have high levels of melatonin when we're eating, if you're out of town all night and having the midnight kebab and pizza, which we all did when we were students, then you're going to lose the benefit of that melatonin. And not only going to lose the benefit of that melatonin, you're going to make things worse. That eating food when high levels of melatonin actually made your blood sugar go up and your weight go up. So the message is that we have to honor our circadian rhythm, and we have to honor and understand living in harmony with nature, and that these body processes have evolved over the last 4 billion years, because every organism has a circadian rhythm. And not only does every organism have a circadian rhythm, every organ in our body has its own circadian rhythm. But those clocks in every organs of our body, because every organ doesn't run 24 hours a day, it has times when it's more active and times when it's less active. And all those different organ clocks are set by the clock in the brain, which is in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And what sets the clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus? Well, that's the light cycle, which is why light is so important. So if you know how to live in harmony with nature and you follow those guidelines and those rules with melatonin, not only are you going to get better sleep, you're going to get better blood sugar control, better pancreatic function, more optimal weight, and melatonin is perhaps the most anti-cancer natural substance that we know. And not only does it kill cancer cells, but the research shows that melatonin looks after the health of our mitochondria. It helps break down old, broken ones and encourages formation of new ones. So the benefit of melatonin is blood sugar control, sleep, weight, reducing our risk of cancer, and optimizing our energy by providing good mitochondrial function. Now there's a caveat to melatonin. I've already mentioned one, that the research shows that for it to work properly, it's got to be secreted and not shut off. And we're going to talk to Todd in a second about what shuts off melatonin production. But also we have to make sure that we're not eating when we have high levels of melatonin. So, most of us now are having a big breakfast, medium lunch, small dinner, and not eating after the sun goes down. That's critically important. The other thing to remember is that the dose of melatonin is very important. And we would normally make about 0.2 milligrams of melatonin a day. And one of the problems is if we ignore our circadian rhythm and switch off our own melatonin production and we rely on taking supplemental melatonin, and some people are taking enormous doses of melatonin, the potential risk in doing that and ignoring the innate wisdom of the body shaped by 4 billion years of evolution is that we can mess up that system. And why that happens is because if we flood our melatonin receptors with high levels of melatonin, it is exactly the same as going to a Metallica concert and standing right next to the giant speakers. Because what do? And we've all done that. We have to cover our ears because we're being exposed to such extraordinarily high sound levels that we're not used to. If we do the same with our receptors, whether that be our insulin receptors or our melatonin receptors, we down-regulate the receptors. They switch off just like we block our ears. So the potential risk of shutting down our own melatonin production and taking high doses of supplemental melatonin is to actually turn our melatonin receptors off. So we get the reverse effect of what we're actually trying to get. So what I'm saying is the research is very clear now that if we want to get the incredible benefits of melatonin, we have to optimize our own production by honoring the circadian rhythm and 4 billion years of evolution and the innate wisdom of Mother Nature, rather than ignoring that and trying to rescue ourselves with a supplement. And so that leads on to you, Todd, where that's all very well, and it would be nice if you and I could see every sunrise.
Yep.
If we could see every sunset, we could spend a day in the sun. We could go to bed every night after it gets dark. But life is not like that anymore. And we have to acknowledge that. So sometimes we do need to use what some people call biohacks to how and try and shape our environment in the 21st century with a goal to making it more resemble a lifestyle that is more traditional for us. And in fact, it was interesting when I was on the plane flying up, I was reading Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography, and he was talking in there about how his mother used to encourage fasting.
Yep.
And how his mother used to encourage eating when the sun was out, and she would go into fasting every time the sun went down. And it's interesting that some of this knowledge is actually traditional. It's based on phronesis, practical wisdom, and then we forgot about it.
Yep. And
now we're just realizing that knowledge that we gained over thousands of years does actually have a basis. And science is just now showing the research for some of this more time-tested practical wisdom. So tell me a little bit about your company and some of the things that you do and why you're doing this and not just working as a chiropractor. So run us through some of the stuff that you've discovered with this work in the area.
Yeah, as a chiropractor, I've been in practice for 20 years, and one of the things I discovered early on is really about getting back to what the natural world is trying to teach us. And if you really look closely and pay attention, you start to see, as you said before, that innate wisdom that's there. And if you start to just follow and honor what's already been sort of presented to us over the millennia, then you can start to actually use those hacks to try to accomplish a lot of this better health overall. So that was sort of my introduction into this sort of field, was through chiropractic, and I created a couple of companies. One of them is Lifestyle Integration, where we deal with all these natural solutions. Another one's called NIR Sauna, where we build, manufacture, and distribute the infrared saunas, the near-infrared saunas. And a large part of that goal is to get people back to, as you said before, sort of honoring sunrises and sunsets and understanding the big value that light therapy plays in a daily lifestyle. And if you get those circadian rhythms correct, as you said earlier, the benefits are absolutely phenomenal, particularly from the metabolism perspective, but as you also mentioned, those other ones. And the research just keeps coming out. It's coming out in hundreds of papers a year these days as far as what photobiomodulation can do. And it just became an area I was fascinated.
For people who are not sure, just tell us what photobiomodulation is.
Photobiomodulation, also shortened down to PBM, is the application of red or near-infrared light to the cellular tissue. And then what happens is the body absorbs that light. Very similar to how a plant absorbs sunlight with chlorophyll, we actually have things called chromophores. These chromophores absorb the light in the mitochondria and actually convert it to energy in the body, which is ATP, as you know. And it's a massive increase in ATP. It also does other functions, but essentially photobiomodulation increases energy, decreases inflammation, and decreases pain. So those are the three primary benefits to what photobiomodulation does and how it works. And naturally, I should add, that we get that from the sun. That's how we naturally get our photobiomodulation, is by observing sunrises and sunsets, because at those times of the day, the percent of ultraviolet light is actually quite low, and the percent of the red and the near-infrared is quite high. That's how we were designed to get our infrared exposure. And another theory that would be out there is fires in the evening. We would have evolved around fires. That's red light. It's also heat. And there's a lot of good evidence that's starting to show up that that is part of our evolutionary history. And we harness that energy at a greater rate than perhaps other animals can do.
So what you're saying too there is that a lot of these new light therapies are not a replacement for sunlight, because we need sunlight. It's incredibly important. But there are times, because of our lifestyles, that we can't get to it. So this is a way of biohacking our environment to make it more closely resemble.
That is exactly the goal, is to make it as close to that as possible. And to do so, you actually need to know the numbers. You need to know what the actual dose is that the sun would technically give you, so that you're not overdosing or underdosing.
Yeah.
It actually turns out, when you measure the irradiance level from the sun at sea level, taking into account all the other factors, it's about 20 milliwatts per centimeter square. And that's probably the dose that we should ideally be looking for most times that we expose ourselves to, the LED lights or the incandescents. But yes, it's not a pure replacement, but it can definitely be a very, very good biohack if you cannot or don't get up with the sunrise and go to bed with the sunset.
So, and another biohack that I talked about recently, because I was in Bali in January doing my yoga training, and I was with a group of 30, and most of them were from North America. Mm-hmm. Now you come from, you have an accent, and it's Canadian.
Yes.
You're from Toronto, and I worked in Edmonton for 2 years, which it's probably even colder than Toronto.
Certainly a lot colder, yes.
And one of the problems is when it's cold, you're also going to have a shorter light cycle. So not only a shorter light cycle, but you're going to get very low levels of some levels. Exactly. Yeah. So that's caused all sorts of problems.
Absolutely.
And one of those biohacks that I talked about is moving south for the winter. Because lots of animals do that. Mm-hmm. I live near Byron Bay, and we see whales moving up and down the coast. Animals move. Yep. To get to the environmental conditions that we want. So one of the biohacks is, if you live in Edmonton or Toronto, is taking a few weeks and heading down to Florida or Costa Rica for a few weeks in summer to get your vitamin D levels, because it's fat soluble, it's stored in your body, but also kind of reigniting the circadian rhythm and things like that. But so moving south for the winter is a good biohack, but also using some of these lights. Now you've got a couple of lights there that you want us to run through. And the other thing I wanted to say is some people now think that all LED lights are bad. Which is not the case, is it?
not.
Because LED lights are very good in a way because they're very energy efficient because they don't produce heat.
Yeah.
It's nice that you and I are going to burn ourselves on our computer screen if we touch it because it's not hot, and it's nice that we can kind of leave it on and not worry that it's going to burn itself out.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily LED, it's all about the wavelengths. Can you,
The wavelengths,
can you
yes.
run us through the wavelengths?
Yeah. This small LED light that I brought through here has 12 lights, and half of them are red lights. They're 660 nanometers. Visual, it's in the visual range, obviously being red. The other half.
So we're going to see that when you turn
If I turn that on, you'd see
Yeah.
6 red lights.
Yeah.
What you would not see is the other 6 come quote unquote on, even though they are on, because the near infrared wavelengths that they're tuned into, 850 nanometers, are invisible. They're past the visual spectrum.
So you're saying I shouldn't ring you up and complain that my light's not working?
That is my most frequently answered question online: is why is only half my light work? Yes. So yeah, this is an example of an LED light tuned into specific wavelengths. Where the LEDs you're referring to are full spectrum that have a proportionate amount of the blue light that's built into them and less of the red light.
And when we say
that's damaging.
When we say blue light, it doesn't come out as blue.
No, it doesn't.
Because I don't turn my lights on at night and my room turns blue.
Right.
So that's a common misconception.
It's a common misconception, and I said it's damaging. It's actually not damaging. We need blue light in the morning to actually stimulate the system.
Yes.
It's when you get too much or too little of something it becomes a problem. So you're correct. It's a white spectrum light, and just like you shine the light through a prism, it breaks it out into the visual spectrum. The problem is we're getting too much blue light.
Too much blue light.
Yeah.
And what are the risks of blue light at the wrong time? Because traditionally, when would blue light be highest?
Traditionally, in the midday.
The midday.
In the midday. That's when you want that stimulating effect to wake you up, let you know it's daytime, that you need to get going, hunting, gathering, whatever it is that you're doing. Yeah, that would be the typical time. The problem, as you alluded to earlier, is the effect it has on melatonin. That is one of the biggest problems. And simply, shortly said, too much exposure to blue light absolutely decimates your melatonin production.
Because it tells us at 8 o'clock at night that it's actually midday.
That's it.
All right, we just had to have a quick drink break, refreshment break. So before that, Todd, we were talking about how we don't want to interrupt the wisdom of melatonin, and that happens with blue light exposure in the evenings because you said that blue light tells our bodies through receptors in our eyes, which are called melanopsins, that it's midday. So we don't want at 9 o'clock at night to be telling our brain it's midday, because that causes inflammation as well as circadian disruption. So tell us a little bit more about the how we're going to get exposed to blue light at night, and how we can prevent that.
The Australian 2015 sleep study, I think it was 2015, might have been 2016, actually went and did some massive research looking into what the sleep habits were and the problems. And in a roundabout way, they actually examined blue light exposure. And what they did is they looked at the demographics of how many people spent time in front of their TV screens in the hour before bed, as well as how many people spent time on their devices in the hour before bed. The percentage is shocking. It's between 70 and 80% across most demographics that are spending time on those devices in the hour before bed. It's also interesting to see that those people were doing that, but what they actually studied was the amount of sleep problems that they had. And a very, very high percent, somewhere between 50 and 70% of those people that spent poor time before bed had one or more sleep problems. Now that inadvertently is certainly alluding to the fact that the blue light exposure from the devices and from TV exposure is what's absolutely decimating our melatonin, and that in turn is the most likely reason why these people are seeing at least those sleep disturbances.
And what's the wavelength of the blue light?
Blue light is much, much lower. It's a much more active wavelength. It's somewhere around that 550 nanometer range.
All right, because not only is it the TV screen and the phone screen, it's also all our lights in our rooms now, isn't it? They used to be incandescent bulbs. So just tell us a little bit about the difference between an LED light, which is very energy efficient, and the old incandescent bulbs.
Well, the old incandescent bulbs, they didn't have the same percentage of blue light in them. They had a much more natural distribution of the visual spectrum, if you want to think of it that way. And nowadays what we can do, instead of using these LED lights to light up our houses, we have some substitutes for that. We can use incandescent lamps if you can get them. You can use an incandescent lamp such as this. This has the downside of producing heat.
Yeah, because you and I, how many times did we burn our hands when we were growing up and decided to change an incandescent bulb without having it cooled down?
Exactly. Whereas this type of bulb has no heat, and it's really only giving you the red wavelengths and then up from there.
Okay, so how can we practically, because the other thing to remember too is not only is it the TV and the phone, it's also the lights and the roof.
Yeah.
And you can tell us about the benefits of blue light blocking glasses.
Yep.
But we also have melanopsin receptors in our skin as well. So we can block our eyes all night long if we like. But if we're sitting there with no shirt on in front of the TV, with our blue light blocking glasses on, we're still going to be switching off melatonin because of receptors in our skin.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about what the blue light blocking glasses do, and then we'll talk about how that they might not be enough.
Yeah, I think for the average person, the easiest solution that allows you to continue to use your technology is to get the blue blocking glasses. And when you wear those blocking glasses, they're the red lenses that you might have sort of seen. They block out effectively the blue, the green, and the yellow-orange light. So really all you're seeing is things in shades of red. That allows you to maintain your melatonin levels. So that's probably the easiest way to go about hacking, the evening exposures to the screens and things along those lines.
Yes, but then we're going to have to sit there. Now in Canada, perhaps you're going to sit there in a head-to-toe suit because it's freezing cold. Although I must say, having worked in Canada for 2 years, it's amazing how many environmental hacks you've got to make sure that you're comfortable. That was one of the problems that they would often go from home to the hospital and back home again with never having to go outside.
That's it.
And always being warm. But let's just say that in Canada you're not going to be sitting around in your undies watching TV because it's cold. So you're then exposing yourself. So that moves on to, okay, well, how can we actually not just wear the glasses but biohack our own house environment?
I mean, the first and foremost would be turn off the lights. Okay. You really don't need a lot of light around the house. And the light that you do need, replace one or two of those LEDs with some of the red LEDs.
Okay, so which would I use? So
it would be this one.
This one. Okay, you were telling me that can screw directly into my LED.
That's it.
Port in the roof.
That's it. This screws directly in. It'll essentially replace the light that you would use, the blue light, so that you can just see under the red light through there. And inadvertently, even though the distance is quite great, you would likely get a little bit of a therapeutic benefit from a photobiomodulation perspective. But this would be a good solution as a hack. But again, turning down or off the lights is certainly another one.
Right.
And you mentioned the skin. Certainly covering up at least a little bit is going to be the way to go. Turning off the lights is certainly. And
how close is the light that comes out of that to full spectrum light?
Oh, this is far from full spectrum. This is not. This is simply two. Right. This one's 2 wavelengths, and people may actually only purchase 1 wavelength, which would be the red, at around 660 nanometers.
But then perhaps we don't want full spectrum at 8 o'clock at night because we normally wouldn't get it. We'd be sitting around a fire.
You'd be sitting around a fire, which would be still closer to full spectrum. It'd be more like an analog scale versus a digital scale, where you get the progressive change. Much like the sun, where it'll go from ultraviolet into blue, green, and so on. But it progresses. You get every single wavelength.
Yes.
I think one of the challenges that we have out there is that these LED lights are simply picking one wavelength. And yes, they've been researched to show that it might be at or close to the peak absorption of that light. But I have a hard time believing that nature is putting out things that are irrelevant. Perhaps it's a little bit like Watson and Crick with DNA, where they were in such a hurry to get to the DNA that they discarded everything that was wrapped around it. Right. And nowadays we're finding that was some of the most important stuff.
Yeah. So evolution of 4.5 billion years of evolution with us under the sun, which started off with
full wavelengths.
Full wavelengths, and that started with 4.5 billion years ago with 2 different types of bacteria, all of which we've subsequently evolved from. And as we know, that started off when one bacteria consumed another bacteria, which created a mitochondria inside a cell, which then split off from bacteria into all other life forms, including fungi, which we've actually evolved from, as you know. And 4.5 billion years of evolution under full spectrum sunlight has is something that we need to honour.
Very much so.
Because we have evolved with that, and that's very important to understand. Which then takes us on to, okay, so we've got some biohacks we can do at house. So making sure after it gets dark at night that we finish eating, making sure at night that we wear our blue light blocking glasses, make sure we turn our lights down, make sure that we spend as little time as possible in front of screens, making sure, considering changing our blue light LED, which is white light, kind of appears white light, to the lights here you've given us, which may also, it gives us the benefit of the melatonin, but it also might give us a therapeutic benefit as well. So let's talk a little bit more about how we can use these lights for therapy, particularly with musculoskeletal problems and chronic neurological disease.
There's a very large body of research on the health benefits behind photobiomodulation, and that includes everything from the skincare industry of reducing fine line and wrinkles. It goes into sports athletic performance, where now the World Anti-Doping Association is looking into photobiomodulation because it's actually providing such a benefit that they're looking at it going, oh, what's going on through here? One study that they did very quickly is they looked at endurance training, just treadmill running on people who didn't run, and after 4 weeks of people being treated with the photobiomodulation and running, they had 3 times more benefit than the group that didn't get the photobiomodulation, flat out.
Benefit in?
Like, what I'm trying to say is after 4 weeks, they got more benefit than the non-treated group did by 12 weeks. So 12 weeks to get the benefit versus 4 weeks with photobiomodulation.
And what was the benefit they got?
Endurance training.
Endurance training, okay.
Yeah. So there's benefits to athletic performance.
Okay.
There's wound healing. That was the original discovery, was with wound healing and hair regrowth. There's benefits to energy levels in particular. That's probably the most important one, is restoring energy and vitality within the body. Massive, massive list.
Right. I've been using my light on my back because even though I was deep in my yoga practice, I was lifting my cold thermogenesis freezer and I tweaked my back, and I've been using my light on my back. So, which therefore suggests that the benefit of that light is that it's absorbed into the body. Tell us a little bit about the red. Tell us a little bit about the difference between red, far infrared, and near infrared first, and how which is going to give us the benefit, and how far they absorb into the body.
We start with red. Red is the shortest wavelength, and accordingly that has the least penetration into the body. So that's absorbed pretty much in the skin level, doesn't go much deeper than that. As you then move up in wavelengths into around, let's say 850 nanometers, that's near infrared. It's still, you don't really experience that as heat at that wavelength, but the moment you start moving up above about 1,000 nanometers, you start to get into mid-infrared, that then you experience as heat. So people get confused by near infrared, mid-infrared, far infrared. They're all part of the infrared spectrum, but near infrared you don't feel heat, mid-infrared you start to, and far infrared in particular you're feeling that sort of heat effect on the body.
Okay, so tell us about the saunas. What's used in the saunas, and how does that help?
With the sauna, it's slightly different to the LED lights because you have the heat benefit, and that's why we use the incandescent bulbs. So they are more of a full spectrum approach, where they use about 30% of their output is in the photobiomodulation stimulating wavelength band. That's the initial sort of PBM benefits. But then what it does is it brings in the heat. So you're getting the benefit of the heat plus a dose of the PBM. So it's more all-encompassing, if you want to think of it that way. But you have to be willing to spend time in the sauna to get the dose and be able to get hot and sweaty. Okay.
Now, I use the photobiomodulation on my joints as well. So tell us a little bit about the different absorption of
the the red, like I said, was the shortest, least depth of penetration, whereas the 850 nanometer wavelength penetrates the deepest. It can go upwards of, different people say different things, 6 to 10 centimeters. It can penetrate really, really deep into the back, into the bone. It can actually penetrate through the cranium and into the brain, and they're actually using that to treat things like Alzheimer's.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about you. We also talked about, in my previous podcast, when I was talking about soil health, I was talking about how important it is the soil gets exposed to sunlight because of the microbes in the soil. But you were saying there's also a lot of research now showing that sunlight, or these focused light therapies on the gut, because it gets absorbed, is actually good for the microbiome.
Yep, there's been a couple of studies just in the last year. Granted, they've been animal studies, but they have shown exactly that. They've increased the good bacteria and they've decreased the bad bacteria. And a very, very recent, just this month, review actually showed that the mitochondria and the benefit that they get from photobiomodulation might be the hub, the main communicating mechanism to communicate with the circadian rhythms, with the microbiome, with the immune system, with absolutely everything. It may be the controlling hub. And if that's the case, sunlight exposure, photobiomodulation is a massive piece of this puzzle.
Okay, and what about, let's talk a little bit, just to finish up, on the research now on light therapy, sunlight, on chronic neurological diseases. Now, one of the interesting things too is that just from a practical wisdom perspective, we know that multiple sclerosis, which is a chronic, probably autoimmune destruction of the myelin sheaths of the nerves, gets higher as you move away from the equator, as you get exposed. And we know that two of the big interventions we can do with multiple sclerosis is increase our sun exposure and eat more seafood, because the omega-3 fatty acids are good for the mitochondria, good for the eyes to get the light signal, and are good for the brain. So let's talk a little bit about how you can, the benefits of light therapy with chronic neurological disease, and whether or not you actually have to walk around wearing a hat on your head with red light shining out of it.
One of the hot topics right now is neurological problems. It is one of the hottest topics in the research that is going on right now, and that includes things primarily Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but also depression, anxiety, and even things like your autoimmune diseases, multiple sclerosis, even ALS. So what they're actually finding is that when they shine the light on the head, there is a certain amount of penetration, albeit quite low, and they are seeing some really significant benefits. And not just, this is in the research, it's not just stopping, right, the progression, it's actually reversing some of the things that have actually gone wrong, which is unheard of in the modern sort of research field these days. So there's some massive research going on into that neurological side of things. And it's been interesting too, in that it's not just when you're shining the light on the brain that you're getting these benefits, it's when you're shining the light on the body as well. And if we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, the sun wasn't going to, at its strength, it's not going to penetrate the skull and into the brain. There has to be communication mechanisms, and that's what they're finding, is that you can shine the light on various body parts and it will have remote effects on distal areas, which is part of how I helped with my ankle recently, where it was fractured. I treated the opposite ankle. N=1 is not exactly a study, but at least it was showing to me that you can actually see very quick results when you're treating opposite remote areas.
Okay, you were telling me too about it. Was it a study or your own personal experience with a wound on the arm?
Yeah, that was a study where they looked at rabbits. They did a cut on one side, treated that with the photobiomodulation, and they got the desired effect of quicker healing. Yeah. But then what they did is they didn't treat the cut, they treated the other leg. And they found that the cut and the wound healed virtually as quickly as if they had shone the light directly on that. And they found a similar result with Parkinson's recently as well. It's phenomenal, this remote photobiomodulation.
And tell me about the Parkinson's study. It was that they didn't actually do the light on the head, but they did it on the body.
Because you mentioned the red light helmet that is sort of popular these days, and there's many ways that you can go about doing it, even just using a light like this. It's the same sort of effect. The study that they did was in a rat, I believe, and what they did is they had Parkinson's-induced disease in this rat, and they treated the head. Yes, they penetrated, they got the results from the Parkinson's, but then they put aluminum foil around the head, and on different ones, and they shone it on the body. And lo and behold, they got virtually the same results without shining it on the head. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes complete sense, and it's why the sun is probably the best, most natural way to go. If you can't get the sun, I think single wavelength therapy is very good, but I think the full spectrum is probably what we really want to be getting into, is either with the incandescents, or there's even other types of lights out there called plasma quartz lamps, and they have much more full spectrum in the treatment range.
Todd, you're talking my language, but you're also reminding me that I've got to get out to the beach.
Yes.
To get my sun. So I hope you enjoyed my talk with Todd. We discussed how incredibly important melatonin is. We discussed how our priority should be in optimizing our own levels and by not shutting it off. And then Todd talked to us about the benefits of the sun, but how we can also start biohacking our environment to make sure that we don't lose the benefit of our melatonin, and also how we can use light as photobiomodulation as a therapy for various illnesses. So if you like today's discussion, make sure you like the video because that helps get the message out. Make sure you subscribe, otherwise the video gets buried away and nobody gets to see it. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks to Todd for his time on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, and we'll see you next time.